So here we are with today's painting. We've had a go at a couple of little A6s. So we've had this one, which is a tree and a path going through, practicing our wet on wet washes and then pushing away to define. We had to go at this little sunset as well, with this lovely couple looking at each other on the beach. Wonder what they're saying. And so we're going to do this little wet in wet practice again. I love these little small papers because they're not over facing. So it's literally an A6 piece of paper. I've taped it to my board. My board can move, which I find helpful. If you need to just draw that, that's fine. We've just got a little river coming down, a fence, a set of trees. So these are nearer, there in the distance, a hill and a couple of bushes. Nothing big. So I've just grabbed my paints, which are my Cotman watercolour paints, and I'm just giving them the first squirt. I do tend to sort of do this a couple of times. So that's like the first morning coffee, wake up, and then I wait a little minute or two, and then I give them a second squirt. And I've just grabbed some paper towels for kitchen paper as well. So today I've got my little synthetic round number 4 brush, which I quite like. It's quite useful. I've also got my small medium mop brush, and I will also be using my size 0 rigger brush, or any similar brushes will work fine for you. It's not a problem. I'm just going to give these another squirt. So as well as my mop brushes today, I'm also going to use a little piece of a plastic card. This is an old library card. And a small piece of candle wax for a bit of wax resist, because I like that. So I'm going to put the candle wax on first. So the light is going to be coming from this direction. I tend to work from wherever my light is coming from in the room. So I'm going to drop in horizontal strokes into the right hand side of this river, and I'm going to drop in some around these trees as well, and maybe a little bit around there, and I'm going to drop in some just along that back edge. It just helps preserve the light, which is really nice. So I can put that away. And I'm getting my little mister bottle, the one that I spray my paints with, and I'm just giving a little bit of a squirt onto the paper. I'm just going to leave that for a little minute, just to let that relax and go into the paper. So I tend to work top down, so I'm just going to get a little bit of cerulean blue, and then I'm just going to add a little touch of ultramarine into that. It's quite blue, very watery, and I just want to grate down a little bit, so I'm just going to add a little bit of red light. It's not a red, it's more of a brown, and it just takes the edge off the paper, off the paint, and makes it sort of a more of a natural blue. So I'm just starting that, dropping it in at the top of my paper. My board's on around about a 20-degree angle. As I said, it's on a slight tilt. I'm going to add just a little bit of cadmium yellow into this mix now, just to grey it down a little bit. You can do that because you've got this red light into the mix. So just added a little bit more red light and we've made more of a grey colour. And I'm just going to drop some of that colour gently around, leaving some clouds. So I'm going to add a little bit more of the cerulean blue into this mix and the ultramarine, and just at the very top of that paper I'm just going to drop in. So this is a wet on wet wash. So I'm just now going to take some of my kitchen towel, scrunch it up, and then I'm just going to dab out some clouds. And it creates quite a nice soft, I'm just going to wipe that away, nice quite soft look of clouds coming up and the blueness. And that little bit of a grey background works really nicely on that. So that one's the wet in wet skies done. I tend to not mess around too much with them. So if you remember, we'd just sprayed just to release, and you can see that the paper is a bit puffy, and if you haven't taped it down it becomes a little bit more difficult to work. So we're going to mix a nice bright green now. So I'm going to add a bit more cerulean into that wash. Oops, a daisy, sorry. And then I'm going to add some cadmium yellow into the wash to make a nice bluey green. Fairly bright. Remember that watercolour ends up with around about 30% lighter when it dries. So, but we do want the green to look like a bit of a distant hill. So I'm just running that down all the way up to that side, and I'm going to just drop in a little bit of burnt sienna into that. I'm just going to add a little bit of ultramarine into there to make like a browny grey. Just to add a little bit of shadow onto that hill. And that should that hill finish. Now if I worked here next to it, it would immediately start pulling that colour down, so I can't work there, but I can work into most of this river with it. So I'm going to pick up some ultramarine and pop it into that space, and I just want to create a little bit of a duller ultramarine, so I'm just going to add a little bit of cadmium red into it just to dull it down. I've made like a very, very bluey purple colour, and I'm going to work across the river. Wash my brush, take the excess water off, and you're creating that underpainting. Wash my brush, take the excess water off, just painting with the pigment that's there. To create the river. So I want to now drop in some more intense blue. So whilst it's still wet, we're working wet in wet. That's the skill we're learning, is that dance. So you a little bit more intense blue. And you can see the wax resist is working beautifully on that edge there. Just going to, I've washed my brush, taken the water off it, and I'm just going to take this excess bead off. So I'm just going to add a little bit of turquoise into this mix, and I'm going to, so this is the darker bank, and because I don't want it running downhill, I'm going to just turn my board around. And so that's just going to, turning my board around, is just going to help this travel across the paper. And I'm going to just add a little bit of indigo into that mix just to darken it. So still the same blue mix, quite watery still, we're still wet in wet, and I just want to darken that water by the bank and along the front. So there we have our little painting is coming together. So we've got the far hill, we've got the sky, a few sort of nice clouds in, we've got the far hills, we've got this lovely babbling brook. I'm just going to lift off some highlights. So I've washed my brush, taken the water out of my brush, and I'm just going to now lift some highlights off, wash my brush, take the water off. Wash my brush, take the water off, just pushing for some highlights. I'm just going to soak that little bead up. So, this is damp. The river will be damp, so I'm going to go and put these distant bushes in across the back. So I'm going to use this green and I'm going to mix in some of that blue just to darken it a little bit, and I'm just going to drop in some trees in the background. So I'm now going to add a little bit more of the ultramarine blue to make like a dark greeny blue colour. Oops. And I'm just going to add that colour at the base of the tree. So this is wet on dry, but we're working, dropping the colour into I'm just going to soften that down. My tape always lets paint run underneath. It's obviously cheap and cheerful. You might have tape that doesn't. Just going to mix a bit of a more yellowy green, brighter green. I'm just going to drop one or two little bits into that little bush so that it looks like you've got more colour. And whilst it's on my palette, I'm also going to just run that green across there. And into that green I'm just going to drop in a little bit of burnt sienna. And some raw umber. Which is like a light browny colour along this riverbank. So there we've got the start of a riverbank. And some fields. So on this side I'm going to use some raw sienna or yellow ochre as a little bit of a contrast. And I'm just going to then use the same grain to drop in and some raw umber. Allowing that wet in wet mixture just to work its little magic on the banks. I'm going to just drop in a little bit of burnt sienna because I like that colour nearer the foreground. And I'm going to just drop in a little bit of Payne's grey into this bank. Unless you want some dark into the riverbank. And if you think you've just gone a bit too much, you can just lift it out. Drop in a bit more blue. So I'm going to drop in some ultramarine blue. That's near enough straight from the palette. And then I've washed my brush and I'm just going to use the water in my brush just to move it around a little bit. I've just popped in a little tiny bit of indigo and I'm just going to darken this front bank and up here. Just dropping some indigo into this dark brown as well, just to darken it up a little bit more, because it wasn't dark enough for me. Wash my brush, take the water off and just soften it away back into those washes. So it's beginning to come together. We've got the river in, we've got this distant tree, and we've got the sky and the clouds. So now I'm going to have a rest and I'm going to leave that to dry. So the light is fading quite quickly here. So I'm having to use a lot of... So the light's fading quite quickly here, so I've had to put the other lighting on, and it does happen. And I'm switching to my other brushes, so I'm starting with this number 4, and I'm going to just mix up a nice rich bluey brown colour into here, around about 50-50 paint consistency. So this is just neutral tint, which is quite a nice brown, a little bit of indigo, and then onto it I'm going to add some alizarin crimson to make a nice yummy dark that's quite thick. You can see that when I move my brush through the palette, it stays but pulls back. So it's much thicker than it was when we were doing the backgrounds. I'm just going to add a little bit more brown neutral tint into there. A little bit more indigo. So I've made quite a dark. It's nicer, always nicer mixing your own darks. And I always just wipe my brush to take the excess off on the paper towel, and I'm just going to put in very quickly, using my little number 4, these trees that I put on when we were sketching. Trees tend to sort of grow upwards. If you look at them, they've got their own shapes. Wider at the bottom. I have to remember to keep breathing when I'm doing this because I quite often just hold my breath. So we've got the basic shapes of those trees. I'm just going to add a little bit more water into the mix on this side so that I can paint the trees in the background here. They will dry lighter. If you're struggling with the width of your brushes, if you move to a finer point brush, you quite often get a little bit more detail. So I'm going to do that now and move into my rigger brush, and I'm just going to put on some finer branches just to add into the base of these trees, because quite often trees like this, they've got quite a few twiggy branchy bits going across, and it all helps to just build that sort of more natural feel, putting the branches across. So this is wet on dry, and we're just building like a little copse of trees, nothing too worrying. Just building up these branches and a little bit of movement. And I'm going to go into these at the back and do the same. So it's like we've made like the main branch, and then we're just extending them for the finer twiggy branches. And you can work at these as long as you want and put as many branches or not as you want. you want them to look more realistic, then just grab yourself some photos of that sort of area. Right, I'm going to just put a little maybe a bit dark, but never mind. Little cups in front. Add a little bit of ultramarine blue into here, just to add a bit of different colour. The base of bushes and things like that are always a little bit fuller, and then I'm going to grab a little bit of plastic card and just scratch out some marks going in lots of different directions. As if it's like a little laid hedge with it. You can also run a little bit up the side of the twigs. I think I've left that a little bit much to dry, but so it adds a little bit of depth with that really quite nicely. So I'm going to use the same mixture to pop in this little set of fence posts. And you don't want them too even, but you do want them to look like they belong. And I'm just going to mix up a little bit of blue and hooker's green just to make a bit of a darker bluey green. Quite thick mixture, and I'm just going to run that into this area. Just grabbing my mop brush, a little bit of water, I'm just going to drop in some burnt sienna into the mix as well. Make like a browny green colour. I'm just going to take a bit of water on my brush. It just adds a little bit of a feeling of closeness because you've got more texture, you've got more going on. So we're going to do a similar thing, so same sort of greeny browny colour onto this one. and the more vibrant, warmer colours to the front, and the darker colours to the front builds your texture. Just putting a little bit of more indigo along that fence line. Wash my brush, I'm just going to bring that into the field. So that blue is just indigo blue. So I've got hair. There it goes. So here I've got the light hitting the bank, a little bit of dark. And I'm just going to add a little bit of dark onto those banks while I've got this on my palette. So I'm building up that sense of the bank. Water off the brush and then just soften it away into that base wash. Wash brush, water off the brush, and just soften it into that wash to build that sense of depth of the bank. So I'm going to grab my trusty table salt that I love. For this one, I'm just going to drop it on this very, very front edge just to add a little bit of texture. And hopefully it's not too dry. We'll see. It's a bit of a dance. So I'm going to put a second wash of dark colour over some of these trees. So I'm going to use some Payne's Grey into this browny greeny wash and my rigger brush. So the light's coming from the right, so I want the dark side on the left. I just want to bring some of these main trunks forward. And just by adding another layer on top, you just bring a bit more depth to the painting. And you just bringing the trees a little bit more to life. Remember, these at the front want to be darker than those at the back, but I am going to do the same just to add a little bit of depth and texture onto these. And the same on these little little fence posts, particularly the ones that are nearer the front. And I'm just going to grab a little card again, and on the right hand side of these fence posts I'm just going to scratch a highlight at the corner of the card. I'm just going to add some violet into this mix, this dark of darks, and some Payne's grey. So I'm just adding to make it even darker, because I want to put an even darker mix on the left hand side of this main tray. Just so it stands out. I'm just going to run, because the light's coming from the left, so I'm just going to run a bit of shadow down under those trays. I was just using the edge of my rigger brush, and I've just washed it. I'm just going to soften those a little bit away. But you can see where that lovely wax resist is for it. So with that dark, I'm just going to add a little bit of the bank definition now. So wash my brush and just push it away. So I'm going to do the same sort of thing over here. Just going to darken this bank up. Wash my brush, take some of the water off, and then just push it into the bag. Well, I'm sorry, I forgot to just record the very last little bits. I've just basically put some highlights on the edges of the trees and that edge of that little fence post on the right hand side, just to lift it a little bit, and then run some Dr. Martens through the edge of the water as well if your wax resist hasn't worked too well. But I'm quite pleased with how that little one's sort of got some movement and texture on there. And I think it's ready for the tape to come off once this salt's dry. See, it's starting to work nicely. And then I might just put a little bit of inking on it, but that's about it really. I hope you've had fun.